ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. Hey everyone, welcome to another great deck tech video here on ChuckWagon MTG. Today we're going over the Ghost Crab of Coralhelm, a white-blue modern build that lets you mill your opponent out and keeps your opponent's board in check. And if the milling doesn't seem to be working out, we have some awesome later game options to just come in and beat face. So let's take a look at our instants and sorceries, as these are going to be our first line of defense while we're setting up. We have 3 copies of Chart a Course, a sorcery for 1 generic and 1 blue mana that draws us 2 cards, and then we discard a card unless we attacked with a creature this turn. This is going to help us fill up our hands and to dig for the pieces of our boards while we're setting up. We then have 2 copies of Dusk and Dawn. Dusk is a sorcery for 2 generic and 2 white mana, destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater, and then on the Dawn side, it's a sorcery for 3 generic and 2 white mana, return all creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. Dusk is to help keep the board clear while we're setting up, and then Dawn can bring back every creature that we have in our deck. To help us keep the board clean, we also have 2 copies of Wrath of God, a sorcery for 2 generic and 2 white mana. All creatures in play are destroyed, and they cannot be regenerated. And then, to keep individual creatures in check, we have 3 copies of Path to Exile, an instant spell for 1 white mana. Remove target creature from the game. Its controller may search his or her library for a basic land, put that card in play tapped, and then shuffle his or her library. For everything non-creature we don't want to deal with, and more importantly, to protect our board, we have 2 copies of Negate, an instant spell for 1 generic and 1 blue mana that counters target non-creature spell. And for the same reason, but for creature spells as well, we have 3 copies of Mana Leak, an instant spell for 1 generic and 1 blue mana that counters target spell unless its controller pays an additional 3 mana. And lastly, we have 3 copies of Opt, an instant spell for 1 blue mana that lets us look at the top card of our library. We may put that card on the bottom, and then we get to draw a card. We also have 2 copies of Elspeth, Knight Errant, a planeswalker for 2 generic and 2 white mana that enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters on her. She has a +1 ability of put a 1/1 white soldier creature token into play. She also has a second +1 ability of target creature gets +3/+3 and gains flying until end of turn. And then she has a -8 ultimate. For the rest of the game, artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and lands you control are indestructible. Now, her main job is essentially to be a distraction and to pump out 1/1 tokens. Now, if we happen to get her to her ultimate, bonus, but that's not her real purpose here. Now, let's check out our enchantments. We have 2 copies of Clout of the Dominus. This is an enchantment aura for 1 blue or 1 red mana that enchants a creature, and as long as the enchanted creature is blue, it gets +1/+1 and has Shroud. As long as the enchanted creature is red, it gets +1/+1 and has haste. Now, we only have blue and white creatures in this deck, so essentially we're only going to use that top ability, and this is going to be just to help protect our creatures and to have them stay out as long as they can once they hit the battlefield. And then we have 4 copies of Retreat to Coralhelm, an enchantment for 2 generic and 1 blue mana that has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose one of these options. You may tap or untap target creature, or scry 1. Now, we'll be most likely using this first ability, and we're going to go over that in just a little bit. And then we have 1 copy of Greater Auramancy, an enchantment for 1 generic and 1 white mana. Other enchantments you control have Shroud, and enchanted creatures you control have Shroud. This is just to give a bit more protection to our Coralhelm Retreat and occasionally our enchanted creatures. And now, onto our creatures. We have 2 copies of Auramancer, a 2/2 wizard for 2 generic and 1 white mana. When Auramancer enters the battlefield, you may return target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. This is to get back our Coralhelm Retreat if we need to, and then it becomes a chump blocker. We also have 1 copy of Restoration Specialist, a 2/1 Dwarf Artificer for 1 generic and 1 white mana that has the ability of pay 1 white mana, sacrifice Restoration Specialist, return up to 1 target artifact card and up to 1 target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. This essentially serves the same purpose as Auramancer, but helps us stay a little more on curve. And then we have 4 copies of Hedron Crab, a 0/2 crab for 1 blue mana that has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. This is another one that we're going to go over its purpose here in a minute. And lastly, we have 4 copies of Ruin Ghost, a 1/1 spirit for 1 generic and 1 white mana that has pay 1 mana, tap it, exile target land you control, then return it to the battlefield under your control. So the idea here is to get our Hedron Crab and the Ruin Ghost and Retreat to Coralhelm all in the field at the same time. Then we can pay the 1 white mana to activate our Ruin Ghost. We're going to flicker one of our white producing lands, and then when it re-enters, it's going to trigger Hedron Crab and then mill the top 3 cards of our opponent's library. That's going to cause our trigger on Retreat to Coralhelm, and then we're going to use that to untap Ruin Ghost, and then we're just going to repeat this process. Pretty much everything else in this deck is meant to protect this combo. For our land base, we have 1 copy of Endless Sands, which is a desert. We can tap it to add 1 colorless mana to our mana pool, or we can pay 2 generic and then tap it, and then we get to exile target creature we control, or we can pay 4 generic mana, tap it, and then sacrifice it, and then we get to return each creature card exiled with Endless Sands to the battlefield under its owner's control. This is just kind of another way to help ensure that our Hedron Crab and our Ruin Ghost stay safe. We also have 2 copies of Field of Ruin, which can be tapped to add a colorless mana to our mana pool, or we can pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice it. We get to destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. Each player then searches his or her library for a basic land, puts it onto the battlefield, and then shuffles his or her library. This is for any kind of key non-basic land that we see in any decks, but will be most likely used to shut down Tron. We also have 1 copy of Westvale Abbey, which can be tapped to add 1 colorless mana to our mana pool. We can pay 5 generic, tap it, and pay 1 life to put a 1/1 white and black human cleric creature token onto the battlefield, or we can pay 5 generic, tap it, sacrifice 5 creatures, and then transform Westvale Abbey, and then we get to untap it. When it transforms into Ormondal, Profane Prince, which is a 9/7 legendary demon with flying, lifelink, indestructible, and haste. This is kind of like a backup win con. If we can keep Elspeth out long enough, we can create enough tokens to flip this into a giant lifelinky beat stick. And then we have 7 islands and 7 plains for the basic lands in our deck. And then we do have 4 copies of Glacial Fortress. It enters the battlefield tapped unless we already control a plains or an island, and then it can be tapped for a white or a blue mana. Our sideboard consists of 3 copies of Intervention Pact, an instant for 0 mana. Intervention Pact is white. The next time a source of your choice would deal damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. You gain life equal to the damage prevented this way. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 1 generic and 2 white mana. If you don't, you lose the game. This is going to be for any burn decks we run into or any decks that really want to outpace us. We also have 3 copies of Leyline of Sanctity, an enchantment for 2 generic and 2 white mana. If Leyline of Sanctity is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. You can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. Another great option against burn decks or any kind of Jund decks we happen to run into. We then have 2 copies of Repeal, an instant spell for X generic mana and 1 blue mana. Return target non-land permanent with converted mana cost X to its owner's hand, and then draw a card. This is essentially just to give us a little bit more control. We then have 3 copies of Stony Silence, an enchantment for 1 generic and 1 white mana. Activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. This is going to be for any affinity or artifact-heavy decks that we happen to run into. Then we have 2 copies of Tormod's Crypt, an artifact for 0 mana that we can tap and then sacrifice Tormod's Crypt to remove all cards in target player's graveyard from the game. This is for any graveyard decks or any of the Delver decks that we happen to be playing against. And lastly, we have 2 more copies of Wrath of God, just in case we happen to need a bit more control of the board. Well, that wraps up our look at the Ghost Crab of Coralhelm, which is a fun new take on your typical mill deck. And while this may not be a Tier 1 deck, any modern deck that avoids direct interaction with an opponent can do surprisingly well at a local level. I want to thank you all for joining us in this deck tech video today. If you liked what you saw here today, do us a huge favor and click that like button, hit subscribe, and be sure to sign up for notifications by clicking that little bell icon that we can tell anytime we come out with a new video, and share this with your friends, your family, your loved ones, and your pets. Everyone could use a little more magic in their lives. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and as always, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, ChuckWagon MTG. Now, if you could do me a huge favor and check out this video about our sponsor. ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games, now at one mega location to fill all of your gaming and comic needs. They have Magic the Gathering events every night of the week, as well as Warhammer, Pathfinder, Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League, Final Fantasy TCG, Pokemon, and Star Wars X-Wing events all throughout the week. They also have close to 100,000 comics on site. This is why I have personally made BC Comics and Games my home gaming store.